Hey gang, Jim Farmer here. It's mid-January. It's mid-afternoon on a cold day with a lot of rain and not a good day to get out on the lake. So I've had some questions lately that's been sent to me in emails and private messages asking about crankbaits and different things like that, what different size crankbaits, the crankbaits that I'm using, the crankbaits that are doing good and where I'm using them and things like that. So I thought, since it's a rainy afternoon, well, I thought maybe I'd make a tackle talk video and maybe we'd talk just a little bit about crankbaits this afternoon. So first, what I want to do is I want to talk about the size of the crankbaits that I have, the size that I like and the size that I offer. Second thing I want to do is talk about the different colors and things like that. And I want to talk about where I'm using these crankbaits, different times of year for different colors, or maybe a different size crankbait for a different time of year. But we've covered things like that, and also I'll talk a little bit about the hardware on the crankbaits, the outer shell. There's two different types of outer shell that I put on these crankbaits, but we'll touch on that real quick. And I wanted to talk just a second about trolling crankbaits too. But first off, let's talk about the different size crankbaits that I use and the sizes that I offer. And basically what I have is 6 different sizes here. And they range from starting at the smallest one, which is a 1.0. Yeah, this isn't an inch in length. It's 2 inches in length, but I call it my 1.0. And this is the smallest bodied crankbait that I have. The next one is just a little bit bigger. It's 2.5 inches, and that's my 1.5. And I have that body in 2 different styles. I have it in a square bill, and I also have it in a little medium diver too, but it's the same body style. So next in the sizes is the fourth different crankbait that I have, and that's this size right here, which is the 2.0, and it's the one that I've been doing real good with lately. It's the one that you've seen videos and pictures of. This one here lately for about the last 3 weeks is the one that you've been seeing hanging out of a lot of my fish's mouths, because this guy's just been phenomenal on the rocks and around docks and things like that. It's the right color right now when the sun's out. It's the right depth as far as that medium diving bill. So that's one that I've been using with a lot of luck. The 5th one in the size is my 2.75. This is a deep diver. This is a medium to medium deep diving crankbait. It's more of a deep diver. It's got a little larger bill, kind of a rounder bill, which gives it a little more action, and it's got some rattles in there, some really good rattles. This is the one that I like to troll with too. One of the features of this crankbait here is it has a hole right there in the bill, and what that does is it makes it run just a little bit more shallow, but also what it does is it creates a lot of turbulence coming through the back end of the bait when it's running through the water. And I like this thing to have some turbulence, kicking up mud and things like that going out the back and making it rattle and making it really bang around. And this is the one that I troll with. As far as this size right here, this is probably my favorite size. This is all around almost every month of the year this size is going to work. But that's my 2.75, and we'll talk a little more about that later. And then my deepest diving one I have is the 3.0. It's a big body. This body is, we'll measure it here. It looks like it's about 3.5 inches. So big hooks on the bottom. These are number 2 hooks on the bottom. But this is the deepest diver. Sometimes I'll use this to troll with, but this is one that I'll use when the fish are their deepest, like right now, or maybe the hottest part of the summer when the fish go out deep. This is the one that I'm going to get them with out there in that deep water. But that's the 6 different sizes that I use on Lake Lanier. And so I've got 8 color patterns that I use. Depending on the time of year and where I'm using the crankbait determines what kind of color pattern I use. Now, and there's 8 color patterns, there's 6 different sizes, so there's 48 different crankbaits that I use and make. And for whatever season or whatever condition, one of those 48 I'm probably going to be using. But I want to talk just a minute about size as it pertains to the season. Right now we're in the coldest part of the season. To me, the fish are more than likely going to be their deepest. So when they're deepest, that kind of rules out these square bills like this one right here. This is a shallow diver, so really you're probably not going to see me pulling that out of the box this time of year. And also midsummer to late summer too, you're probably not going to see me pulling this out of the box much. This is something that I would use in the spring, but not this time of year. This time of year, January, February, cold water, I'm going to be using the deeper divers, the medium divers, the medium diver here, and my deepest diver, but I'm going to be concentrating on the deeper fish. Now, if you've seen some of my videos and blog posts and things like that here lately, this guy right here, I've been having, this is a 1.75 with a sand key pattern. I've been having real good luck with that pattern. If somebody was to ask me what my favorite pattern was on Lake Lanier and the best pattern for catching fish and what's caught the most fish, it would be this one right here, the sand key pattern. So that's number 1 of the 8 patterns that I like. The second pattern that I like is what I call my Z-shad pattern. This is a little black and kind of a little silver with a white belly, black stripes on the side. But this one kind of more mimics a shad, maybe say a gizzard shad, small gizzard shad, or maybe a threadfin shad or something like that. But this is the Z-shad pattern, and that's one that I like to use in the spring and in the fall as a shad pattern. Another real important pattern that I like, and that's a brim pattern. Out on the lake, we've got a house on the lake, and we've got a dock out there in a little cove, and we're feeding the brim out there, and the neighbors are feeding the brim. So there's a lot of brim that get up in that cove. And during the summertime, the bass are in there every day, just patrolling that area and eating those brim. So that's why I made this brim pattern right here. I've been watching these bass just chasing these brim and just wreaking havoc on the brim all summer long up in those coves. So I made that crankbait pattern for the brim. This is one that you'd use around docks because there's a lot of people on Lanier that feed brim, and the bass know that. And so whenever people come out to feed the brim, the bass show up in big numbers to eat the brim too. And we've watched them do it several times. So brim is another pattern. Translucents are something I use in clear water in the summertime, in the rocks, deep diving translucents, and even smaller ones in the summertime I might use on the rocks. But for clear water, you can go with these translucents. I think they work really, really well in clear water. Probably better than some of these ones that are painted bodies. But translucents are another good color, and I've got 2. This is kind of an emerald translucent, and then I've got a blueback translucent, but I use those quite a bit. Crawfish patterns, this is a winter crawfish pattern. I use those. Also use a summer crawfish pattern here. I'll use that in the summertime. Sometimes you'll see us using crawfish patterns quite a bit around the rocks. And also sexy shad. I make a sexy shad, which is a good crankbait to use in the spring in shallow water. This is a square-billed sexy shad. We'll be using that in March and April, especially if the lake's full and you've got a lot of water up around a lot of vegetation. These square bills right here, when the bait goes to spawning in the shallow water and the bass go up in the shallows, these sexy shad square bills are the ones to use in that shallow water, as well as the this shad pattern or Z-shad pattern here. So that now we've talked about the sizes and we've talked about the different color patterns and things like that. A little bit about where I'm using these. Right now I've kind of discovered that a lot of these bass, especially the bigger bass in the afternoons when it's sunny, They're getting up against the rocks in some shallower water because the rocks are getting heated up a little bit by the sun. So the bass are coming up in there, and the crawfish are up in there with them warmer rocks too. And this is what I've been banging off the rocks here, is this bait right here. Probably the number right now, it's probably the #1 go-to crankbait for me. It's a medium diver. Remember, we're not really using the shallow divers right now. We're using the medium divers, but this is one that's a medium diver. It's not got the wide fat bill, so it doesn't have quite as much action, but when you get this thing around the rocks, it's got some good rattles. Now, the second one that I've been using when I want to go a little bit deeper is a 2.75, and this is the one that I troll with, and I've been trolling with for the past few days. But 2.75, if you look at some of my videos, this is the one that I use quite a bit. And I want to talk to you just one brief second about trolling these baits. And one very important thing about making these baits run straight when you troll them, and I'll tell you what that is right here. Where your attach point is, where you tie your line right here on the bill, there's a little ring there, and that's where you attach either your line or your slip ring. Let's see if I can find one here without the slip ring on it. But that little ring right there, you've got to make sure that that's straight. That's called tuning a bait when that's straight. Sometimes these little things get laid over to one side or the other. They get bent up. I can tell this one just from looking at this one. It's been a little bit over to the left side, which is going to make this bait run to the left. So what you want to do is you want to adjust these things. You can take a pair of needle nose and move it, but you can kind of eyeball it and center it and make sure that it's nice and center down the center line of the bait, so your bait will run true. But if your bait doesn't run true, let's say that it runs off to, say it runs off to the right a little bit, then you'll want to take your needle nose and maybe bend that little eye right there just a little bit to the left. And sometimes it takes a little while to get these things tuned in, but the idea on these crankbaits is you want them to run straight. You know, I troll a lot of these crankbaits, but I also throw them a lot, and whether you're trolling them at a high speed or just casting them and retrieving them, trying to get them down to the bottom, you want to make sure when you do that, it's running straight and it's not just moving from one side to the other. So in order to do that, you've got to tune that little eyelet right there in line and move it and adjust it till you get it to where the crankbait's running in pretty much a straight line. And that's one of the most important things about running these crankbaits, is getting them tuned up before you use them. If it's not tuned up, it's just going to run in a big circle, whether you cast it or troll it. If you cast it and you go to cranking on it, it's going to pull to one side or the other, and it's not a really good presentation for the fish either, and it's going to cut down on your catch rates. So that's one of the most important things about your crankbaits, is adjusting this or tuning this eye to where your crankbait runs straight. So with that being said, I want to talk just a minute about the hardware and the outer shell that I use on these crankbaits. As far as the outer shell is concerned, there's two different types of outer shell that I use. One is a hard coat 2-part epoxy, which is pretty thick. I put that on there, and it makes the body really hard, really durable. It doesn't really chip. I mean, it can take a licking and keep on ticking. One thing about the 2-part epoxy, I've done a lot of research on what other guys use and tackle guys and stuff like that, and I pretty much use what everybody claims is the best. One thing about 2-part epoxy, when you use 2-part epoxy, it's thicker, it goes on in a thicker coat, and it'll make the crankbait a little bit heavier. In terms of how heavy, one coat of 2-part epoxy is about 1/10 of an ounce. So if you were to put 2 coats on there, you'd be pushing close to 1/4 ounce. So I use it on a lot of my baits that I'm using around the rocks and things like that. I'll use the 2-part epoxy because once again, it can take a licking and keep on ticking. Especially on these smaller baits, I'll use 2-part epoxy on these little crankbaits because I like that extra weight. It'll help me out when I'm casting these little things, and the crankbait will still float, so you're just putting a little extra weight. So maybe maybe just one coat of 2-part epoxy. Maybe you can put 2 on there if you really want to weight it down a little bit and get a longer cast, but that's the 2-part epoxy. And also it provides a pretty good finish on these baits too. It lasts a long time and it's really durable. The second coating I'll use, see if I've got one here. You can't really tell the difference. It's just a little thinner coat, but this is called Moisture Cure Urethane, and it's durable just like the 2-part epoxy. It's thinner, so it doesn't weight it down. It's not as thick. It's still as durable, but it doesn't have quite the thick shine that the 2-part epoxy has, but I use Moisture Cure a lot. It makes the color just a little bit different. So in terms of when this thing is running through the water with the 2-part epoxy, there's a little bit of gloss to it. With the Moisture Cure Urethane down deep, there's very little gloss. As for what that does for the fish, I've used both of them. I don't think that there's one that's better than the other one. It's just that there's different characteristics. The 2-part epoxy weighs a little bit more. It's just a little more chip resistant, a little more durable, where the Moisture Cure Urethane is a little thinner, it's a little lighter. It's durable. You're probably not going to scrape this off or chip it or anything like that, but it's just a thinner finish and it doesn't have quite the gloss that the 2-part does. So that's a little bit about the outer shell. As far as the hardware that I'm using, primarily I'm using Eagle Claw 375 nickel trebles. On my small baits, you're going to find me using number 6 treble 375. When you get up into the medium and the larger body baits, it's either going to be a number 4, or on the big baits it's going to be a number 2. But I found that these are good hooks. They're dependable hooks. They're sharp hooks. They don't bend. They hold really good, and as far as sharpness, if you guys look at my YouTube page and go back a little bit late last spring, well, you're going to see a video where I buried one of these hooks in my thumb and removed it, so that'll give you an idea how sharp these things are, and I trust them 100%, especially after burying a few in my fingers. So anyway, that's the crankbaits that I'm using right now. As far as where I'm using them, right now, rocks and docks are the best places. Something with rattles and something in this sand key pattern, that's the best thing that I've found. But that's a little bit more about the crankbaits. So hopefully we're going to continue to catch some good fish on them, and